is at 6:34. We always like to just give a couple of minutes to get folks here in the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see you all back here. I'm really happy to have you all here with us tonight. If you feel comfortable, please go ahead and turn on your camera. It's all to see your faces, just like we're back in the bar. I know so many of you. I'm Krista Hoffman Longton. I am with IUPUI and Indiana University School of Medicine. And I am so excited today to welcome our two experts. We have two this month to talk about Ready Player Two. I think we're going to have a really lively discussion. So before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping items like usual. I'll get started with those housekeeping items and then we'll jump right into some content. So the first thing that we always like to do is to thank our sponsors at Books, Booze, and Brains. As many of you know, I myself was a volunteer. Many of us are volunteers. So we do have some folks that help to support this program and make it happen. So thank you so much to Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, who helps to manage our live stream, and Central Indiana Science Outreach. And then also Indiana Public Library helps us with marketing. The other thing I want to mention is some of you may know Leah Namias, who has been a great supporter of this program. Leah was with Indiana Humanities and has really supported the program since the beginning. Leah's left Indiana Humanities to pursue other opportunities. So this is kind of a moment on our live stream here to say thanks, Leah, raise a glass and say how much we appreciate her support over the years. Really, really happy to have with us tonight Kristen Fuss-Wells from Indiana Humanities. The Indiana Humanities crew will continue to support us. In addition to Kristen, we'll have some other folks who join us over the months, but really happy to continue to have Indiana Humanities support. So thank you, Kristen, for being here and for helping us manage the conversation just as Indiana Humanities has done it in the past. So a couple of other housekeeping items. Many of you know these things. In terms of using Zoom here in this space, please make sure that you're muted when you're not talking. There will be opportunities for you to move into some breakout rooms, and we want to just make sure to kind of manage ambient noise. Be yourself and be respectful of others. I think that that's especially true. Matthew and I were talking about some of the representation issues that we think are kind of inherent in this book, and we want to talk about that a little bit. So just be respectful of others. Sometimes what comes through in the chat isn't exactly how it would come out of your mouth. So just be aware of that. Do ask questions using the chat feature, which is located on your toolbar, usually on the bottom of your screen. Use the reactions feature, which is also on the toolbar. Many of you have found that reactions feature, sort of like emojis, it lets us know how we're doing and if we need to speed up or slow down. Our planning team members will collate your questions. I sometimes get to talking and get excited about the book and I might miss a question. Please know that's not about you, that's about me being excited. So I'll ask Kristen to help us monitor the chat and kind of keep track of things. As I mentioned, we will have an opportunity where we'll ask you to turn on your mic and camera to talk to us a little bit. And when we do that, there is a half-second delay. So when you hit that unmute button, take a breath and then speak, and that'll help us to not talk over one another. And then lastly, and this is the big one for this one. So as you know, the Books, Booze, and Brains fam, we often read nonfiction books, right? We try to do a couple of fiction books a year. I'm going to do my best not to spoil this one for those of you that have not finished the book, right? We try to be very open here at Books, Booze, and Brains. That said, if you're in your small groups and you all agree like, hey, let's just talk about the end of the book, I'm cool with that. We'll do our best. My questions tend to be broad tonight in part because we don't want to try to spoil it for everybody. That said, beware, spoilers may come up. I'm just kind of saying that out loud, but we will do our best. I think that's it for housekeeping items. So with that, I will go ahead and kind of jump into content for the night. And I'll start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about their work and their area of expertise and how that relates to Ready Player Two. So Matthew, I'll ask you to start. Give us maybe 3 to 4 minutes or so about kind of what you do at IUPUI. And then Matthew, once you're done, I'll go ahead and turn it over to George. So Matthew, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Krista. I just want to say thank you to you and Kristen and Rufus and everybody and Leah posthumously for having me here. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed the original one with George, and I did this years ago with Ready Player One. So I'm glad to be back for the sequel. And good evening to ladies and gentlemen. Hope you guys are doing well. And George, thank you for letting me go first. But no, my name is Matthew Powers. I'm a professor of media arts and science at IUPUI in the School of Informatics. I've been there for 13 years. I call it 13 years of not getting fired, so that's pretty good. And I am one of the chief game and creature character storytelling professors there, I suppose you'd say. I teach game 1 and 3. We also do a history of gaming, which is very popular. We do gaming prototyping. Right before this event, which again, I'm very honored to be here. So thank you guys again for having me here. It was fun to get through all of this and certainly have opinions on it. I just got done with my creature, alien, and character design class. So we try to help people make all new worlds, all new areas, all new experiences. And we also do Games for the Good, which is a class where we try to use gaming to help people. One of our recent projects, we made a series of 3D prints, comic books, and video games for a little girl who was 10 years old and had just defeated stage 4 lymphoma. So in honor of that, we had taken her characters, brought them to life, and made her world a reality. And that's another reason why I'm connected to this. I currently have a student who is making a whole new world in the Unreal Engine through VR. And he's flipped the script in terms of you actually play as the dragon defending your horde from the humans. So I have spent my entire life working on my own characters, creatures, and worlds and games to try to create immersive environments for other people to explore and experience, and to help heal and to just give people an outlet, which I have found we've needed more than ever in these times. But also I will say this just for the sake, because I do believe in it, a good life is like a good game. Both are balanced. So I do believe in gaming, but I also believe in going outside, like they said at GDC last year or 2 years ago. If you're going to make a game about skydiving, go skydiving. So this Ready Player 1 and 2 have been an interesting journey for myself because of the ramifications of where what I do for a living and what I try to provide for people can go in some interesting and horrific ways. But no, that's pretty much my whole thing. I'll shut up because I got to keep it put together. But that is what I do and teach and create. So again,
thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
I know that you'll have a lot to say about these characters, about the narrative arc of the characters. One of the things I think that's so interesting about this book is thinking about the ways in which the characters changed or maybe didn't change. I don't know. I don't want to spoil. George, go ahead and tell us a little bit more about you and what you do at Purdue.
Hello, everybody. I'm George Takahashi. I'm the lead visualization scientist of the Envision Center at Purdue University. The laboratory that I work at specializes in creating virtual simulations for education, visualization for looking at complex data sets in complex sciences. So anything from looking at tomography to geospatial data in either virtual reality, augmented reality, or other forms of visual techniques. I've been with the laboratory since 2009. I joined as a graduate researcher, and I've kind of been there ever since. So I'm following Matt's philosophy of, well, I haven't been fired yet, but I'm very passionate about any type of research that focuses on cognition and perception of volumetric information. So anything that's three-dimensional and hard to understand in, like, let's say a 2D screen, if you can provide that information in another medium that might be more intuitive, then I think that's something that merits discussion. And if that experience also takes you to better understanding of techniques or scenarios, I think that could be a very powerful means of communication as well. So that's kind of been my motivation and my drive to with the work that I do. And within of Purdue University, we work with faculty as well as researchers across campus, whether it's working with veterinary scientists one day, all the way down to working with, let's say, a nuclear reactor the next day. We have a fairly broad portfolio of types of projects. I would say the majority of our work focuses on the educational purposes of these simulations, although we do have quite a bit of gamification within inside of our learning as well. And within inside of our internal group, we also do quite a bit enjoy virtual reality applications in game form and entertainment media. So that's basically myself in a nutshell. Our small laboratory has about 15 to 30 students. It kind of fluctuates from semester to semester, but we have anywhere from undergraduates all the way up to postdocs working within inside of our laboratory doing their own research as well as working with us to help promote other research that occurs across campus.
That's great. Thank you so much, George. I think that helps give us a little bit of context, and also helps us to think through some of the sort of real world applications of what's happening in this book, right? I mean, I think that obviously Klein created this world with the idea that he certainly is a lover of nostalgia and sort of sees the fun in these, both in the characters and I think in the technology. But I think that you make a good point. And to some extent, this is something that Wade touches on in the book as well, right? The idea that the ONI or the ONI has lots of really exciting, in theory, exciting applications in the sort of world of human work and connection with others. And so I hope that we'll have an opportunity to explore how some of your work maybe augments the human experience, whether that's in the world of work or the world of education. So thank you for the background. So what I want to do to get started actually is to jump really early tonight, relatively early tonight, into a question that I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms for. And in part, it's because I think that one of our best starting points is to like get some of your perceptions and your ideas out on the table as far as the ONI, the ONI. Because I think that that's going to be the fodder for most of our discussion tonight, is how this technology is portrayed in the book and some of the and ethical implications of the technology. So my first question that I'll send you to breakout rooms to talk about is, let me pull up my little document here so I've got it ready to go. It is, let's see here. So the book starts right after the first book, right? So it's like days literally after the first book. With the news of the development, so Wade discovers the OASIS neural interface, or the ONI, which Matthew, you gave us some background on that. Tell us, what does ONI mean?
Well, actually, Oni is, since I teach creature design, that is the Japanese word for demon, a generic word for demon. Onis can be any shape and size and species, but as soon as I read that, I just went, okay, here we go. That is definitely one heck of a message concerning this technology.
That's a great point, Matthew. That's one of the things I noticed as well, right? Is that like immediately going in, lots of foreshadowing here. And obviously this is a young adult novel, right? So one of the things to keep in mind as we are exploring, you were saying, Matthew, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in Japanese culture, we explore this. Onis are primarily evil, but there also are neutral and good ones as well. They are used to denote spirits of various degrees of alignment. So that Oni is such a term. It generally means evil, but it also means potentially good and neutral, which is perfect for the device itself, because personally it's used for things that I can talk about later, but also, like you said, it's used for some very good aspects too. So it's a very mixed bag. It is certainly not black and white by any means.
Great point. Great point. So that allows users to experience the OASIS with all 5 of their senses, right? And record their experiences in real life. Because it taps into users' brain and bodies, they can't use the ONI for more than 12 hours at a time. So my first question for you is, in your breakout rooms, I'd like you to talk about, given what you know about the ONI, right? So you are in Artemis's shoes, you are in Percival's shoes right at the beginning of this novel. Would you be all in on using the ONI? Would you be like, sign me up, I want to be in the beta testing group? Well, I guess they've already tested it in theory, right? Or would you resist using the ONI? As you read the first few chapters, I'd love you to talk in your small groups, like, what were those warning signs for you? Or where did those like little bells go off of like, I don't know that this is going to go well. Obviously, you got to have a rest of a book, right? But I would love to hear from all of you about kind of what are some of the warning signs that you saw early on in the book. So I'm going to put our Turn and Talk question in the chat for you, in case you would like to, in case you'd like to, take it with you. You can always copy and paste it, bring it with you into breakout rooms. If you're new to Books, Booze, and Brains, in a few minutes, you're going to get, a few seconds, I should say, you're going to get a pop-up notification on your screen that's going to invite you to a breakout room. Those breakout rooms are assigned randomly, and that'll be your breakout room for the rest of our time together tonight. So you'll see these folks again in a few minutes. So what you'll do is just click the OK, take me to the breakout room. We'll give you all a chance to talk for a few minutes, and then we will bring you back to this main room here, and we'll sort of debrief our questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and send you off to your breakout rooms. Give me just a second here. All right, so you should be headed to some breakout rooms. If you have any trouble, just go ahead and come back to the main room here, and we will help you solve the problem. And for Matthew and George, just a reminder, you're going to stick around here in the main room, and we will hopefully have a conversation here. I'm going to, let's see here, move a couple of folks around. All right, wonderful. So let's see, we lost Matthew. Let's see if we can bring him back. All right, we'll work on bringing Matthew back. George, you can kind of carry this one for a second while we get him back.
Sure thing.
So the way that we sort of started here was kind of by talking about the extent to which we lost you, Matthew. There you are. Welcome back. Oh, you're muted.
Muted.
You'll always come in muted.
I got invited to room 3, so I was just talking to Tibor, and then I got invited back. So sorry, I just went where the invitation went. So my
That's
apologies.
okay. Yeah, no, there's no way to like stop an invitation to you when I randomly assign. So that's the limitation of the technology. Speaking of limitations of technology.
Fine. We had a nice minute of hey, how you doing? And now we're back.
Good. Well, hopefully they'll still have a productive conversation. So let's kind of start with this question. So George, I mentioned a little bit earlier that there were some like warning signs for me, like maybe we want to think twice about how we're using this technology. As you read the beginning of the book, what were some of the things that were concerning to you about this technology?
Well, I think we already started out with a good understanding that there's privacy concerns. Even in the first book, this was a topic of discussion where being able to watch in on what other people are doing, what information is sent to the headquarters of the company that you're subscribing to. This is a topic that is extremely, prevalent in today's, hardware as well. We don't have anything as sophisticated as the Oni, but it is still a topic of concern. And if you're also addressing sending, biological data as well as, emotional information or things that go very far beyond describing what a person is like, to some other resource, especially a private company, there'd be alarm bells going off all over the place saying, how is this data being used? What is the privacy rules? And as you go through the book or the first 2 chapters, you're already seeing even further violations by the owner of the company. So there's some pretty big concerns with that. And I would say, I have to be careful not to name any companies, but there are companies today that are running into those same kind of concerns. As if you do have access to a platform that can distribute hardware as well as content, and you have the capability of retrieving some of the information that comes with those devices, how does that get used? Does it get utilized for analysis? Does it get sold to a company for advertising revenue? Or could it be used for nefarious purposes if somebody breaks in? I think these are topics that should be considered fairly heavily, even before coming to the consideration of the device and the technology itself and the potential dangers of using something that taps into your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite books, and I mentioned this to Rufus as we were preparing for tonight, is M.T. Anderson's book Feed, which was, if you've not read it, it's outstanding. It was nominated for a Newbery Medal when it first came out. Also, a young adult novel that talks a little bit about this connection, about the concerns related to the biological connection. And when I've taught Feed in the past, I've taught that book in my Intro to Mass Comm course, and I talk about all of the ways that we do allow technologies to come into our bodies, right? So thinking about the idea, my mom had her knee replaced a couple of years ago, right? And I mean, that's a low tech sort of intervention, but an intervention nevertheless, right? It has a barcode on it, it has a serial number on it. She knows it's hers and it's attached to her. And so, like add that on to things like cochlear implants, right? So when we're talking about sort of ways in which we let technology into our bodies, I think that, even though we're not talking about like this really invasive concept, there are lots of ways where we're doing that even right now that maybe we're not thinking about. So I appreciate your sort of addressing some of those broad privacy concerns and then talking specifically about some of the biological sort of fears that I think this book taps into. So Matthew, one of the things that I think is interesting about the Oni is the extent to which we have characters like Wade, who again, Wade is like, I always remind my colleagues that are 18 and 19-year-old students that their brains are not fully developed, right? So like Wade is still to some extent not a fully formed person. And so it wasn't surprising to me that he talked about addiction, for example, right? The idea that his brain is sort of wired to find risks. And so I'm wondering, Matthew, as you think about sort of narrative and developing the structure of this novel, what are particularly some of the challenges with the Oni as it relates to Wade, that main character?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I was just thinking I was going to bounce this off of what George was saying, because to me, the entire book, one of the main overall meta themes is the combination of power with a lack of wisdom. You say, I mean, that's what we've got going on here. The entire Easter egg hunt produced by Halliday is inherently flawed, because it could have been a 10-year-old that won the quest. It could have been an 8. It could, who knows? It was open to everybody and anybody. It was a complete chaotic, it was a little boy's fantasy given to the world without thinking of repercussions. You see, so I mean, you've got Wade, who is, and again, I work and teach with 18, 19, young people all the time. And I still remember being young. We all remember that. There's impulse control. There is, a lot of fantasy driven aspects that they want to, there's a lot of, I don't want to say illusions of grandeur. I'm not knocking them, but there's just, there's a lot of dreaming, a lot of things, a lot of fantasy based stuff. And then when you're given that, you can see how that is instantly corruptible. I mean, you've got a device that is recording people's experiences and downloading them and making them into whole new, brand new creatures. And you've got someone behind the wheel who barely has their their learner's permit, orchestrating this entire thing. You see, so that's what I found most disturbing about the whole thing, was just the lack of wisdom underpowering the whole thing. Halliday seems to be emotionally stunted. I mean, he's brilliant in what he does, but emotionally stunted, and you can see the ramifications of that across the entire concept of the Oasis, the Ready Player One, the Ready Player Two, etc. Now, I'm sorry, I'm getting off context a little bit, but could you repeat that again for me to a certain degree?
Absolutely. So I was talking about sort of what are some of the ethical implications of kind of putting Wade at the helm of this technology?
Well, I mean, I think we see it. I mean, the ethical concerns is we don't have anyone who we have a person who's had a very difficult life, has not been able to connect with other people, who is now instantly connecting with everyone. So you're going from an all or nothing. You're showing a complete dichotomy. And just like he says in the book, and I agree with this too, we are biologically designed to exist within smaller groups as opposed to everyone all at once. So not only are you corrupted by the power and the control that is naturally inherent to most people for safety reasons, control and power comes out of a sense of safety, but then it's exacerbated to the nth degree by being able to control everyone on the planet. So the ethical ramifications of this are extraordinary to me. I mean, in any other normal real world setting, you would go through, I mean, just getting hired at a job, you would go through a portfolio review, you would go through a phone interview, you would go through, I mean, you would just
You
go through.
wouldn't just win a contest and get the
Right. I
job.
mean, I'm sorry. To me, that's why this is a true fantasy novel. It's hard to accept the reality of it. It certainly is a commentary, but it's a commentary of fantasy. And I mean,
And to some extent, a commentary on the notion of what it means to come of age, right?
Right,
Like,
yes.
like thinking about sort of how do you, and actually that's one of the critiques I have of the book, is I don't think, and we can talk about this more in a minute, that Wade is that much wiser at the end of this
No.
book than at the beginning, and which is fundamentally sort of what the point of a young adult novel is. So
the arc is there's not much of an arc as it is kind of a straight, jagged line. And if there's anything this book has emphasized for me, it's why we need stronger ethics studies at younger ages. Because I mean, my children are getting into, VR and iPads and gaming and having control. My daughter the other night was on a server trolling people in Among Us, and I had to sit her down and say, this is not what we do. This is not what we do as a thing. She's 10. So obviously, there's a certain degree of communication I have to work on there. But, there's this just kind of like once she realized she could just aggravate and control and do stuff, she just went full force without thinking of ramifications. And I explained to her what happens when you're banned from a server, what could happen in the real world, et cetera. And the whole time I'm thinking, man, I hope we double down on our ethics teaching across the board, because if we're going to allow this kind of power to seep down throughout the years, because this will go down. I've seen my own students hack into things in the classroom. And I've seen students acquire power without the wisdom or the solid enough ethics to understand the ramifications of what they do. So yeah, I mean, you're right.
That's a great point. Yeah, that there's that arc. Okay, yeah. I'm going to bring everybody back so that we can have some conversation back with everybody. So let me bring everybody back. Hold on for me, and we will hear about their.
My class. Yeah.
It's hard, right? It's hard to kind of balance that. I love having these conversations, and I always want to make sure that we get all of the voices heard. So we've got a 60-second warning here coming back. And when they come back, they will come back muted. So just a reminder for folks coming back into this main room, you should come back in muted. And we will, once we debrief a little bit, we'll ask you to unmute yourself. Thank you all for having, I hope, really good conversations in your breakout rooms. We'll give everybody just a moment to come on back. We had lots of good conversation here in the main room. Looking forward to hear about what your conversation sounded like. Just wrapping up those breakout rooms. It looks like folks are having good conversations. It's always fun to see when folks want to take that full 60 seconds to wrap up their conversations. It means that there were good conversations happening and I had to interrupt them. I'm so sorry. Don't worry, you'll have a couple more times to chat with one another. All right, looks like everybody's back in the main room here. Welcome back, everybody. We had a really lively conversation here. I hope you all did as well. So I asked our two guest experts to kind of comment on this first question, which was, given kind of what you know, would you be all in on using the ONI like Wade, or would you have resisted it like Artemis? And what I asked specifically kind of was to you and to George was like, what are some of the concerns that you have with this technology? And more interestingly for me, what are some of the concerns that you have with putting Wade at the helm of this technology, given I know that Wade has maybe had some struggles in the past? So George, I would love to start with you first. If you wouldn't mind kind of talking a little bit about what you see as some of the concerns that stood out to you really early on in the book, particularly related to the privacy issues that you talked about. You're muted, George.
Thank you. So yes, one of the concerns that we have with these type of devices, even in a simpler form to what we have today, they have some form of communication that is sent back to a private company. So from a privacy consideration, if Wade or anybody for that matter has the ability to gain this data and potentially use it for whether it's data collection selling it to advertisers, or potentially doing nefarious things with it. What are the potential repercussions of that? And if it's just usage data, that's one thing. But now if it goes further to actually getting biological information or emotional information, this takes that so much further. And I think that is something that is kind of glazed over, in the book. And I think especially when giving this type of level control to a young adult, they fall in the same kind of footsteps of, well, here's our user agreement. Let's just hit accept and get to the good stuff. Had I been given the same kind of choice, where if I was told, here's this really fancy device that can do some amazing things, I would have to hesitate quite a bit, knowing what I know, as well as what I would love to know by, experiencing this. I would have to hit the brakes pretty hard to say, I have to get a lot more information before I even touch this thing to even go further to actually, sell it to end users. There's going to be a lot of concerns. So that was my idea.
Take on that. Yeah. And I think that that leads really well into my question for Matthew, which was really kind of focused on that main character, Wade, who is, I always joke with my colleagues about the idea that I teach college students and medical students, and have to remind folks that for most of them, their brains are not fully developed yet, right? So we have a young person at the helm of this organization who has really experienced significant trauma in his life, and now has this incredible responsibility. And they do sort of touch, or Klein sort of touches on the idea that there's a period of time where Wade talks about the idea of experiencing addiction associated with the Oni, and that he is able to overcome that. But that's talked about very quickly before we get into the quest of this book. So Matthew, could you talk a little bit about kind of how you talk about the ethical implications of these kinds of technologies, particularly when you're talking with your students about game design and those kinds of things?
Well, yeah, again, the multifaceted approach to this thing, like I said earlier in the earlier forum with you guys, I found the whole thing to just be, when I finished the book, even the first one, especially the second one, I just am hoping to myself, God, I hope we're really endorsing our our ethics classes throughout grade school, undergrad, grad, doctorate, etc. Because I mean, what you're doing is you're giving an 18-year-old who's had not just traumatic experiences, I mean, growing up in the stacks, growing up with whose father is gone, whose mother is gone, who's dealt with an abusive aunt, surrounded by addiction and violence and all these things, and then has expressed himself through this fantasy world. You've basically then turned him into a god by giving him this machine. And you're dealing with a person, again, because like you said, the human brain doesn't fully cure until the age of 25. And I teach young kids all the time, and I love them and everything. But there's a lot of impulse control issues. People want to jump in and do it and play the game, and there's no wisdom. This is action without wisdom. I'm sorry, I'll try to spare you all the whole with great power comes great responsibility quote, but I just didn't. But the point is, I mean, you've got a brilliant genius like Halliday, who is completely inept when it comes to humanity, who builds this beautiful playground for himself, invites everybody into it, and then completely unethically, in my mind, gives the contest and ownership of the one solid underlining foundational device to whoever could have won a contest, who could have solved a riddle. And, like I said, this could have gone to a 10-year-old. This could have gone to a 12-year-old. Who knows who it could have gone to? You know what I mean? There's no telling. And just like I was telling George and you in the other room, I mean, just in any other real world situation, there is a vetting process. There's an iteration process. To get my job, you had to go through a phone interview and a portfolio review and recommendation letters and things like that. So the whole thing is just, to me, just a fantasy within a fantasy. So, but I could see this happening. I could definitely see this happening. I could see certain power groups just giving this off to other people, saying that I'm over and done with this, and we'll see what happens. But I'm really hoping the one way that this can be balanced out is to endorse education and ethics and ramifications and awareness. I mean, that's the one thing the book tries to expunge or expand upon, the fact that this is the Oni, the demon software or the demon hardware. It really allows you to experience other people and other things, but you don't really see that, as you said. The character arc of Wade is not so much of an arc as it is kind of I don't want to give spoilers, but it's more of it's not exactly an arc. Let's just say that it's more of a plateau. Again, I hope that's not a spoiler, but it's just not as satisfying as you think one would have towards the end of it. So to me, there is a lot of ethical aspects behind this thing, and also just and like with my own students, I tell them, I say, we are escape artists. We're making escapism for other people, but at the same time, we can't lose touch with the world that made us. I mean, like I said earlier, to make a good game and a good experience for someone, you must have said experience. And the Oasis is such an addictive manner. It's such an addictive environment. I mean, again, I'm trying not to spoil the ending. I mean, there are people that want to spend their whole lives in that thing. And I love Artemis's points about why don't we fix, and Jane McGonigal made this point years ago in one of her TED Talks, we can have gaming, but why don't we use gaming to fix our world so that we want to spend as much time in the gaming world as we do in our real world? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's a great point.
It's an escapism. So with my students, to go back to that point, I tell my students, we want to make a good experience for people, but we also want to make it so that they want to go experience for themselves. Just personally, I try to spend every Friday going to a park with my kids or somewhere. I'm out in front of a computer all day long, but you have to encounter the real world. You have to encounter what's real, because at the end of the day, the plug can be pulled on the Oasis and everyone can be shunted out. And then we will have to deal with the real world issues. To me, it's a novel
So
that,
I'm going to,
oh, sorry, I'll shut up.
oh, I'm sorry, Matthew.
I'm
I'm
just
gonna,
gonna say,
no, that's okay. I'm gonna jump
escapism
in because what
is
you've
worth it.
said there, I think leads us really well into our next question, which is actually for you and George. And I'm gonna ask George to speak on it, and then I'll ask you to speak on it. And this is really about kind of gaming for good, right? Which is to some extent, one of the things you're talking about is that sense of balance. But I would also like to talk about kind of what are the ways that we see this technology potentially adding value to the IRL world, right? So my question for you both is that in different contexts, both of you have looked at how VR and other technologies, gaming technologies, can help build empathy or kind of connect others with different experiences than our own, which like early on, Wade argues that this is one of the most important parts of the ONI, right? Is the idea that it allows you to sort of feel the experiences of others. So can you talk a little bit about, George, if you would start, about how you have sort of seen VR and other technologies used to build empathy among others, and kind of how you've seen technology as a good tool to do this?
Mhm. Yeah, so if we start in just kind of a rudimentary view of the technology, where it's used as a method to experience just something, right? Let's place you in a room, right? You're already providing some form of stimulus with minimal context. But then if you start adding details to that context or experiences that relate to somebody else's experience, you're essentially starting the process of putting somebody, metaphorically, in somebody else's shoes, right? And I think that's something that is kind of hard to do in real life. It's, if I was of a certain race, I can't potentially see what it would be like unless I were to put on a bunch of makeup or experience something similar to that. But inside of a virtual world with fairly minimal equipment, you can essentially get at least the visual and auditory start of that. And that could already has shown to be quite impactful, especially if it's tied with compelling storytelling. And we've seen a lot of independent groups and even researchers start exploring that, and taking some of this, these experiences and disseminating in such a way that people can get a taste of what it's like to be somebody else, and potentially or utilize that as a vaulting point for discussing what must have been like for this individual who went through this. And I think that's really the first stepping stone into 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 a perspective of empathy. Thinking about what it is that this other person is experiencing, and how does my action later on potentially prevent that kind of experience, or improve that experience, later on.
Thanks, George. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, that one of the things that the technology does have the potential to do is to create a little bit of space for conversation, right? But again, it's stimulus material. It's not the only thing, right? But it's that mix of having that technology intervention maybe, or that experience mixed with an ability to process with others that I think, again, of course, the communication professor says that, right? But that's the thing that makes this technology powerful, is that it does sort of prompt us to think about our sense of self and our relationship with others in a new way. And you mentioned, George, as you were talking, so I'm going to turn it over to Matthew now to talk about kind of why story is such an important part of building this sense of empathy. So it's not just the technology, right? It's not just about walking in someone's shoes, but it's also about stories. So Matthew, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, sure. No, I mean, the story is the underlining, axle of everything that we do where I'm at. And the one thing I do want to say real quick in relation to George is that when it comes to the VR and the creation of empathy, we're just at the cusp of it. Like I said, I have not really honestly seen too much of it. I know people are researching that, but I've actually seen empathy not so much generated by the programs we create, but by the students creating the programs. That's what I wanted to mention too. I've seen more empathy and as they're making it than people experiencing it. I know that'll change. But no, the story an incredible part of it because it is through these it's well actually through I would say research stories. That's the thing that really needs to be one of the new trends now. A lot of people will write about other races, identities, genders, perspectives, et cetera, without too much research. And one of the things that I'm very happy to see is that people are researching more and interviewing people of other identities than themselves. And so once they get that research, then they can combine their talent of writing and story creation, and then they can get a decent perspective and then apply that and attempt through the experience, whether it be a comic book, video game, virtual reality experience, to at least touch on in a tiny droplet of what it's like to be said person of this age, this creed, this color, this size, this shape, etc. And then it just comes down to a perfection of iteration of how well, there really needs to be more of a secondary analysis of what do people walk away with. That's one thing that, you write a book, you write a story, you write a game. Did you have fun? Great. But there really needs to be more of a deep dive of, do you understand what it's like to be said person? Or do you experience this? Or do you experience another world, culture, economic status, etc.? So I believe that, a story is the axle, but we really do need to have these side buttresses that really help enhance it. And then there needs to be a secondary or a cursory after research aspect that says, was this effective?
I think that's one of the things that we've been using humanities for years, right? As some of you know, that I do some research around humanities and medical education. So looking at to what extent having students connect not just with the biological science, but also to connect with art and storytelling, their own writing as a tool to be able to build empathy. And I think, so obviously humanities has done that for centuries, since the human started, right? And so thinking about how do we then use technology as a tool to kind of augment that experience of story, I think is really powerful. And I think that, Matthew, that's one of the things that you talked about here. So one of the things I want to mention here, and as I was, again, preparing for tonight, I mentioned to our two panelists, I usually read the book and then I go kind of out in the world and do some research about the book, but I try not to read the reviews and listen to interviews until I finish the book. And as I was kind of preparing for tonight, I was thinking about the game That Dragon Cancer, which is one of my favorite games to talk about with students. And I don't know if either of you have familiarity with this game, or I'll put the link in the chat here for those that are interested. It is, I think, a very different kind of game than what we think of in terms of creating a quest, and that I think really does speak to this notion of what are the ways that technology can be used to really augment that empathetic experience that we want folks to get, that we know kind of creates that perspective and that sense of understanding. So there's a link in the chat for those that are interested, and thank you, Matthew, for sharing those ideas. So we've got another question that I think will be helpful, but before we do that next question, I want to hear from all of you related to that first question that we talked about in the ONI, right? As to whether or not you would be all in, or you would have some apprehension. And so if you would be kind of one of the early adopters of the Oni, will you kind of give me a thumbs up? Use your emojis button, your reactions button at the bottom of the screen. So if you, knowing what you know about the Oni, would anybody be kind of all in early on? Looks like we've got a few folks who are interested in it. And it seems like we have a lot of folks that are waiting. And I have to say, I was kind of one of the wait and see folks as well. But I did think about just how excited I was when I bought my new iPhone, that I was really kind of like, as much as I want to say I would be the person who would wait. My question, of course, is how long would I wait? I think it's something that's worth thinking about, you know, that I think is one of the things that is interesting and that this book really brings in. Look, Rita, you found our new yes, no buttons. Good on you there. We have a couple of new buttons in the reactions tool. So if you want to use any of those other buttons, you're welcome to as well. So our next Turn and Talk question, to this next one, and then I promise we'll process as a whole group. In part, I want to get to this next one because it's not really a secret confession at all. It's not even a confession. Some of I am a huge Prince fan. So this was like one of my favorite parts of the book, was that I get to come to Books, Biz, and Brains and talk about Prince. Klein opens level 5, which in my version of the book is on page 136, with one of my favorite Prince quotes that I actually use all the time, which is from a 1999 awards show where he starts with it saying, "It's cool to use the computer, but don't let the computer use you." Right? That there's a war going on and the battlefield is in the mind. And so I thought it actually might be helpful for us to see the whole clip, mostly because, you know, I love Prince and I get to say what we do, which is really. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll show the YouTube clip of Prince from 1999, so you all can kind of see his warning, if you will, to the group. All right. If somebody could give me a quick note in the chat to let me know whether or not you see that screen, that would be great. Can everybody see Prince there? Yep. Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. I'm going to hit play. Here he is.
So one thing I wanted to say is don't be fooled by the internet. It's cool to get on the computer, but don't let the computer get on you. It's cool to use the computer. Don't let the computer use you. You all saw The Matrix. There is a war going on. The battlefield's in the mind. And the prize is the soul. So just be careful. Be very careful. Thank you.
All right, so there's a warning from Prince, right? Awfully prophetic. So my question for all of you is, in what ways are the characters in Ready Player 2 used by the Oni? And how might this translate to all of our experiences with technology? So again, kind of listening to Prince's wisdom, who has so much wisdom. What are the ways in which the characters in this book are used by the Oni, and how might that translate for us in real life? What are the ways that we are potentially used by our technology? So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and send you to your breakout rooms again, and then I promise that I will bring you back and we'll have some time to chat about that as a large group. So opening breakout rooms now. Hey, Matthew, stay here. We'll see you back in about 10 or 15 minutes, everybody. All right, so it looks like folks that might have gotten ready to go are going to go. Let's see, John and Bill, if you're with us and you want to go to a breakout room and for some reason that invitation is not showing up for you, let me know and I would be happy to kind of help with that. Otherwise, if you want to hang out in the main room and listen to us chat for a few minutes, that is fine too. So George, let's start with you on this one. So we've talked about kind of around this a little bit, and we've talked about some of the privacy concerns. What are some of the other ways that the ONI is sort of using the characters?
I think from the topic of use, I can't help but think about dependency to a device. We talk about the ONI also having companies utilize this platform for advertising or potentially even selling content through this. We saw this in Second Life. There were full companies that had marketplace within inside of this entire ecosystem. Uh, by tying themselves into a platform like this, you you may become kind of stuck into into that, and by not having some way of diversifying, or potentially even from the end user perspective, if you need that to communicate or experience or even just get through the day, when you talked about addiction, that is very much present in that. You mentioned your cell phone. You have something that's in your pocket that if you don't have for one day, you may start having withdrawal symptoms. I've taken camping trips where I sit down and realize, oh my gosh, I have no signal, to the point where I don't know what to do with myself. I think that is a type of use, the where it has such a stranglehold on you that you're not able to function without it. Even if it's temporary, that is a form of control. And I see that being very powerful the more dependent we are on the technology. And that's perfectly shown with inside of this book, where you have a time limit where people are already going up against that, spending half of the day inside of this system, that when they're not in that system, now they're sitting there thinking, well, what can I do now? Well, yeah, I just use the non-ONI version of this system and still get my fix.
That's a great point, that it's very much in the same way that you could use your smartphone just to make phone calls, right? Like that you could, right? You could use that one, that like if you need to talk to somebody, you can, actually talk to them in real time, not over text. But I think that you're right to say that like the device and even the way that we use the device, we get conditioned to use it in that particular way. I have a colleague who studies communication about time. And one of the things I've heard her talk about this, and I'm sure this is widely studied in sort of technology and ethics, it's just new to me, is the extent to which the structure of our work days are dictated by Microsoft Outlook. Right? The idea that like we organize our day in 15-minute increments because that's what Microsoft Outlook gives us, rather than thinking about like what, I had a former dean in my life where all of his meetings were scheduled for 45 minutes, because the problem with an hour-long meeting is that people are always going to take an hour. But if you give everybody 45 minutes, then you're just using 45 minutes and you have some thinking space in between meetings. And so I think it's interesting to think about the idea that pretty quickly we and I guess I'll ask you whether or not you think it's conscious or subconscious that we sort of let the technology and the device dictate our behavior.
I think to a certain extent it becomes, subconscious, especially when it's something that's so, prevalent. I mean, we've seen even in early stages of the development of a technology that you'll start seeing essentially the creation of an entire culture of behavior, right? And these things aren't formed in a vacuum. There's other things that are adding to that culture and that behavior, and it sort of almost grows in a very natural form. Do we have full control over that? I don't think so, especially when it's something that's so interconnected with other people, that now you have a huge social sort of construct. And because of that, I think there may be conscious decisions on sort of a microscopic level, a lot of these, but from an overall system, it is so widespread that I don't think we have that level of control. And we see this already with social media, and the
Yeah,
type of communication that happens.
that's a really good point. I was thinking as you were talking, one of the things I talk with my I teach an undergraduate course in interpersonal communication. And one of the things that I talk with my undergraduate students about is some of Sherry Turkle's work, which I'm sure you both know. Sherry Turkle is a sociologist at MIT. One of the things that she's really interested in is how social media changes the way that young people construct their sense of identity, their sense of self, right? And the idea is that without social media, you start to build a sense of identity about who you are, primarily based on a very small group of individuals and their perceptions of you, right? So your parents kind of tell you the kind of person you should be, your small friend group at school tell you the kind of person should be, and that's how you construct your identity. And it's primarily about constructing it for you in reflection of a relatively small group. But when you are exposed to social media very early on in life, you start very early constructing your sense of self for the consumption of others. So you end up sort of foregrounding and backgrounding particular aspects of your identity based on that experience of how others consume you and consume who you are. And it's really, she in her book Alone Together, she talks really powerfully about this. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about there. So that's really interesting. Matthew, what thoughts do you have about this question about the ways in which we are used by the Oni?
Well, I was loving George's word about dependency because when you look at the Oasis, I mean, the whole thing centers around the big red button. I mean, the fact that, I mean, Anorax, I can never say his name correctly, but his argument about against it is one of his arguments is that you will destroy all civilization. Civilization is only hanging on because of the Oasis. We have bank, and just like now the internet, banking, I mean, I pay all my bills online. I show kids checkbooks just to see their reaction. We have one central hub, one central vein to which all of these interactions go through. And it is a very powerful tool. And we are beyond, George, I'd say we're beyond dependent. It's a symbiotic and parasitic relationship that we have here with this thing. I mean, we really do. I mean, I've talked to people and they don't know how to write a check. They don't know. And again, I'm not trying to sound like a boomer or an older, but I mean, there are certain skill sets that are being lost because of our dependency with this culture. And that is within the context of that this will always be with us. But the thing that I have learned from being a game designer is that every machine can be turned off. Everything needs to be backed up. Everything, that's why I always have a problem with cloud computing and cloud, servers and stuff like that, because if that were to go down, we don't have local. I love to have a local copy and a cloud copy. You see what I mean? I'm not trying to get off topic, but it all to me relates to one another in that we have the Oasis is an extended, exacerbated, fully symbiotic parasitic entity in which we're all consumed with, and we are used by it and it uses us. It is a creature of our own controlling, and it is a Frankenstein monster that gives us great pleasure and gives us great opportunities. Just like I love that section of the book where they talk about how it's used to help people with physical therapy. They talk about how it's used to help people walk again, and of course we want all of that. We want all that to go through it, but at the same time, do we really want a system that if it were to go down, it takes us with us? It's almost as if the crust and the mantle of the earth would just collapse without it. Does that make sense? I mean, I am blown away by how intertwined we are without it.
Absolutely. I mean, even if you think about things, I mean, Matthew, you and I both work on the IUPUI campus, and I can recall a few years ago on the days when the internet went down, one of those days where the internet went down, and literally we're sitting around twiddling our thumbs, right? Like none of us can do anything. And so I think, especially because, as to your point, so much is stored on the cloud and so much of what we do is on the cloud. So I think that those are really good points. I'm going to bring everybody back here, and then I would love to, I'll let the groups speak first, and then I'll ask you all to sort of restate some of the comments that you made. And I've got some notes, so I'll prompt you a little bit. So bringing everybody back here, give me just a minute. All right, we should have folks coming back in about 20 seconds or so. And I think I'll first ask folks to sort of react to the Prince quote, because again, I get to control the conversation, so I get to talk about Prince. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what some of their perceptions are related to this question about control. And it looks like folks, I'm always happy when it takes a minute for folks to come back, because it means that they're having really good conversations in their breakout rooms, right? So it makes, as a teacher, that makes me really happy. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes to bring everybody back. Whenever it takes folks some time to come back, I just said I'm always happy, because it means that folks are having really good conversations in their breakout rooms. So thank you all for doing that, your willingness to engage there. So I wanted to start with listening to a little bit from all of you and your conversations. I know that that's one of the hallmarks that all of you like from Books, Booze, and Brains. So if you had a particularly salient or interesting conversation in your breakout room and would be willing to share with the group, I would love it if you would turn your camera and mic on. And again, this is related to my favorite artist, Prince, and his quote about how we don't want to let the internet use us. And so my question was, in what ways are folks used by the ONI, and how do you see that maybe play out in real life? And I see that Hannah turned her mic on. So Hannah, I'll let you go first.
All right, hi everyone. We discussed a bit about how characters were being used by the ONI, but there was also a lot of people being used by people through the ONI. So for example, like people recording their experiences and being paid to do it. It's like they're doing it of their free will, but their experiences are being exploited, especially if it's someone who's shooting up heroin so that someone else can experience that, or people doing crazy stunts. I think one person suggested people might tend to do crazier and crazier stunts to get attention and get paid, and then like get into like serious trouble or get hurt, everything that kind of already happens, you know, in day-to-day life. And I think we also concluded that Wade is probably the person who's getting used the most by the ONI, because he's so addicted to the Oasis already, and he's so letting it rule his life to the point where, you know, he's even getting isolated from his friends. And we had a bit of an argument about whether he grows and learns from that. I was kind of on the more negative side that he doesn't. Someone else said, no, I think he does. But it's a pretty big struggle for him to get any growth regardless, because he's so mired in this in the beginning.
That's a great point, Hannah, that we talked a little bit about, I did talked a little bit about identity and how our identities are shaped by these technologies. Sometimes, I don't want to say I think that we're complicit in the process, but I think that the way that our identities are shaped by these technologies is kind of one of the fundamental questions that we face when we talk about the ways in which we use the internet, or the ways in which we use these technologies to connect with one another. I'm particularly elephant in the room. We're all on a technology, right? Giving of our own experiences and perspectives and sharing things to the cloud right now. And in part, we're doing it because we can't be together in person, right? And so thinking about kind of what are the ways that we make sort of trade-offs, if you will, about, you know, I give fitness information to my Apple Watch because it's motivational for me to exercise, right? So we kind of, you know, trade off those things. And I think that that's one of the things that we see Wade struggling with is, as you said, Hannah, he's really addicted to the Oasis, and we know that he is. And we've got to think about kind of how does that shape the way that he interacts with others. Any other groups want to sort of mention a little bit about their conversation? Jen, go ahead.
So we talked about how all of us really help build kind of artificial intelligence. If you've ever had to do that, I am not a robot, or the word thing, and how because people are making the artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence only has what's available to it from people, it can make mistakes. And I point out, isn't it ironic that in the first book, one of Wade's favorite movies and his first task is this 1980s movie about artificial intelligence that gets the wrong information and tries to destroy the world. So I found it, I was like, oh, there's that young adult thinking that he knows better, right? Because he knows this movie. He had to do the whole script to pass this test about how, hey, AI isn't the best thing because it's got to be written by a person. And even if it's learning from other people. So I almost feel like there's a good Harry Potter quote where Mrs. Weasley says, don't trust anything where you can't see where your brain goes. And I think that's a really good message for this, because again, even though it's a computer and it's supposed to be learning, it was programmed by a person, and from anybody who's read the books, by someone who's not that stable. So we probably shouldn't trust the information that went into that artificial intelligence.
That's a great point, Jen. And I think that really kind of illustrate the idea that, and that's that whole, again, I'm going to bring it all back to Prince, of course I am, right? That like, you can use the internet, but don't let it use you, right? That mind and soul sort of disconnect is where we see those challenges happening. George, you talked a little bit about the notion of dependency, that when you saw this question about like how are folks used by the ONI, that was the place where you went. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right. So I mentioned it a little bit from a business perspective, as well as just from a as an end user, the sort of functional perspective. If a company were to essentially have a single outlet or a single platform that's dependent on another company, then they're essentially at a single point of failure that could potentially jeopardize, their entire, their entire company. So I think that idea of dependency on a platform that is outside of your control is of high risk. And when we think about just the ONI, it is still just a tool. But I like the what was just mentioned, previously, where there's more behind it. It's not just a tool, but it is the people behind it. It is the software developers behind it. It's the private company that's behind it, that also has that information. There's also the personal side of use, where similar to how we work on our, from day to day with a smartphone, dependence or over dependence on a piece of technology may remove a lot of those capabilities from you. So you might not know how to function to a certain extent. When is my next meeting if I don't have something or some device to tell me, when that is. Or let's say, for example, if I go on a nice vacation,
George,
and
I feel
don't
so
have...
exposed. I have no idea when my
You feel
meetings.
personally attacked?
I have no
Yeah.
idea when my meetings are if I don't have my phone. I think that you're right. You were talking about going on a vacation. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, right. Yeah. If you go on a vacation and you don't have an internet connection, you suddenly feel like withdrawal symptoms. I don't know what to do with myself. I become bored. These are all symptoms of overdependence on a single technology or a single point of failure. What do we do if we don't have it? And I think that is a form of use and control that we need to be aware of.
That's a great point, and I lends itself really well into talking about some of Matthew's perspectives about this question of use. And Matthew, you talked about the notion that the ONI, and to some extent our relationship even with the internet, is both symbiotic and parasitic. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about what you mean when you say that, and how you think that plays out in the book.
Well, yeah, naturally. I love what George said about dependency, and I just take it to another degree, especially since I just taught creature class, and that is the internet and the Oasis we are both symbiotically connected to it. It is relying upon us, we are relying upon it, but it's also parasitic. We need it, but it also drains us at the same time. We need it for communication. We need it to pay our bills. God forbid somebody walk into a bank and actually hand someone a check. Like I said, I've shown checkbooks to my students just to get them to go, what is that? So there are certain skills that are being lost and traded in back and forth, and I don't quite know where the balance is, but it is a symbiotic thing in that we needed to take care of things fast and efficient, because we're in a much more fast and efficient world, and I could have a whole other conversation on that. But it's also parasitic because we feed off of it for attention and love and gratification, and then it feeds off of us for that back and forth. So in a paradoxical sense, the dependency to me is like this intertwined series of serpents it's like an Ouroboros. We feed off of ourselves. We must consume ourselves, so we must continue to exist. I hope that doesn't get too weird for people, but it really is a very strange paradox, and it's one that we must try to, I think that we are in a place where we have let it run amok and run out of control. And I feel like we're almost on a bucking bull of we're enjoying it, but we're going to get thrown off one of these days. And one of the things I had mentioned earlier is that we are so dependent upon it that we're not taking the time to look and see what happens if it goes offline. One of the things I talk about in my classes, which I need to bring up earlier, is game mortality. There's a ton of games where hundreds of human hours have gone into them, graphics and programming, design and story, and you can't play them unless they're modded forward because we don't have the technology. And gaming and technology is one of the few things that is not backed up. I mean, it's not like with the Mona Lisa where you go, well, it's been 500 years, we got to get rid of her. But games, I tried to play a game from the 1990s. I had to have our tech department bring to life a Windows 95 machine to show kids what the game was like just to get it to work because it wasn't modded forward. It was a beautiful simulation game from Star Wars and it was award winning, but we couldn't play it. So you see, we have this ongoing just kind of consumption creation cycle, which if we're not careful, we will be consumed by it as well. So I love what you said, George, about the dependency, but I think we need to take a more serious look at the ramifications of this ongoing churning of the symbiotic and parasitic natures of both the internet and its big brother, ironically saying, the Oasis.
Thank you so much, Matt. Wait, was that you, Matthew, that wanted to add, or George, did you want to add a comment? I just want to make sure that I give you the airtime that you were looking for. Nope, you're good. Okay, so I have one last turn and talk question, and this is going to be a short one because we've had lots of really good, I think, really robust conversations today. The time goes so fast. So my last turn and talk question, because don't read novels very often in Books, Booze, and Brains, we don't always have a chance to kind of talk about some of the creative aspects, I think, that are associated with what we read. And as I was reading some of the reviews of this book, I ran across a review that had an interesting critique that I thought would be a very good kind of stimulus question for all of you in your turn. Like I said, this will be a shorter one. I'll still bring it back so you'll have a little bit of time to ask your questions of George and Matthew. So this is from the Wired review of Ready Player 2. And it came out just in November of 2020. So if you just Google it, you can find the text of the review. But the author of this review argued that, that potentially creative industries have become bankrupt in such a way that much of today's popular culture is a remix or a reimagining or an unnecessary reboot of successful things from the past. So again, the reviewer was arguing that one of the problems with this book is that it really is just a remix, reimagining, or unnecessary reboot of successful things in the past. And I guess what I want to know about this is a lot of people love this book because of all of the 80s references, right? I loved the Prince chapter. I'm just saying out loud, right? Like I can't get enough. But I want to know about whether or not you think that this remixing or this kind of retelling or incorporating of nostalgia into our existing culture, whether you look at, rebooting Ghostbusters or bringing back some of the games that we knew and loved as kids, is that a good thing? Or is there a lack of creativity in relying so heavily on those just positive emotional associations that we have from being kids? And again, some of this is about being of the time, but I guess what I'm asking is, in what ways is relying on this nostalgia good? And in what ways is relying on this nostalgia potentially a cop-out? So a more artistic question, perhaps, than what we usually do in Books, Booze, and Brains. But I think it lends itself maybe where our conversation went. So I think, Kristen, were you able to put that in the chat? There we go. Thank you so much. I enlisted Kristen because I know I get to chatting in these questions, and I want to make sure you have a succinct question to bring with you to the breakout rooms. So I'm going to give 5 or 6 minutes for this one, relatively short. We'll bring you back. George and Matthew and I will talk about it. We'll finish up with some of your questions. All right, sending you back to your breakout rooms. Enjoy your conversations, everybody. All right, so it looks like folks are headed into their breakout rooms. Folks, if you don't get that invitation and you would like me to resend it, let me know. Otherwise, I will. Looks like we're good. All right, so George and Matthew, this is kind of, like I said, this is as artsy as books, booze, and brains gets. Usually we try to focus on the science questions, but I like the idea of some of the, I have to be honest, I think that there's a little bit of an art critique here, but I also think that there's a critique about evolution. The concept of evolution, not just in terms of the Darwinian sense, but in terms of thinking about what are the ways in which we should be evolving and what kinds of questions should we be asking about how much time we want to spend in the past versus thinking about the future. So George, I don't know if you want to go first maybe, and then Matthew respond with that.
Actually, Matthew, do you want to start this off, since I think you're going to have a much...
that, yeah. Well, thank you, George. I appreciate that, because this is a absolutely massive topic in my classes. Like I said, I teach game, comic, storytelling, creature design, etc. And one of our chief rules is that it must be as original as possible. Just like I talked about today, no other IP, Batman, Ninja Turtles, nothing is allowed. I am trying to get these students to delve into the back of their brains and try to come up with something they've never seen. One of the key components of my creature and character design class is to create something we have not seen before. Because when I talk to recruiters and people in the industry, they really are secretly hungry for something new, but they only cash in on the stuff that's proven to be successful because they have such a small profit margin. And so the thing is that the way to be successful nowadays is to do something totally original, something great and wonderful that catches people's eyes, put it onto YouTube, onto some other platform where you can do a grassroots approach, and then build up a fan base, build up a thing, and you evolve, your audience evolves, your content evolves, and then some other larger company can pluck you up and then present you to the world. You see, that's one of the things, because it is very difficult for our students. I had a student one time that said he only does Sonic fan art. And I said, in my class, you will not be allowed to do that. You can take inspiration from Sonic, but you will not be able to do that. He didn't take the class. There is an absolute crutch when people, I love nostalgia. I love it too. It's very wonderful, but it's candy. It's very much candy. It's not going to sustain your mental imagination. You must rely on consuming other people's work and then creating your own. That is the meat, potatoes, and vegetables of creation. And I'm sorry, I will shut up, but it is really important that we enjoy the nostalgia, but recognize it as a mental candy. So then we do the hard work of creating something new, and we have repeated cycles, or we have new layers of sediment, new layers of imaginative sediment, not just rehashing over and over and over again. Sorry, it is a major pillar of all my classes, because it is so difficult for people to try to create something original. So enough said there, but thank you, George. I mean, yeah, because I deal with this every day.
Look, George is like, yes, I'm getting on the bandwagon. George, so thoughts for you, I would think, as you think about the ways in which we use technology, there does need to be a little bit of familiar in order for us to be able to kind of get on board, understand how things work. So can you talk a little bit about how you balance the familiar with the new?
Yeah, so let's say some of the stuff that we do inside of our laboratory is focusing on simulation for training, where the point of it is to create as realistic of an experience as possible, so that when you go from one system, the virtual, to the real, you can carry over the knowledge and the learning materials, the lessons learned, you can carry them over as seamlessly as possible. So let's say, for example, with flight simulation, you're going to want to practice on something before you go out there and potentially fall out of the sky. So, but when we talk about
that.
Yeah, I don't want our pilots getting into trouble, but when we talk about other experiences, being able to balance, especially the creative, being able to balance the materials with something new, as well as taking in content or infrastructures, story structures, and sort of inspiring off of them into something new. I think it's very important to be able to have a common ground or some familiarity that users can latch onto, as something that is completely foreign will alienate an individual. If it's something that's so far-fetched and so new or original, it's completely unheard of, it might be extremely risky from a business sense. And Matt, I think that's something that I appreciate, because that's the kind of perspective that I take is, why are companies rebooting? Well, financially, it makes a lot of sense. It's easy, it's cushy, but it is candy, and I really like that analogy. But when it comes to, like, let's say, personal responsibility for creating a game, it is very much a crutch, and I think there is quite a bit of personal responsibility in as a creator to recognize those pieces of candy and be able to see, where you can make a difference in the content that you produce, using, as I said, things that may be familiar, maybe utilizing or leveraging, existing archetypes to build something, but still try to have something that's interesting,
It's a
something
great
that's
point.
new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That idea that like we can't subsist on candy, right? Like it's good, right? But it's not the only thing that you can eat and still be able to live.
May I, and again, may I just jump in for 1 second? I don't mean to be too harsh with it, by the way, too. I do understand the need for familiarity. I do understand the need for that. I do understand. And that to me is inherent in the system. When people create a character, they will have a natural affinity to something on Earth or something they're connected to, et cetera. It's just that to me, the familiarity is already inherent in the system. It's just how far can we push it? So it's not too far fetched, George, unless that's what we're going for.
Right.
But then also, but I also love doing that too, because if we can push the boundaries of our imagination and accept something new, then that becomes normalcy. You know what I mean? It's like Zone Zero out there in the Oasis, where they keep pushing it, making it bigger and bigger. So no, Chris, I don't mean to be rude and say it's a total cop out. I just say that we can't keep rebooting. With the familiarity is inherent. So let's see what we can do with the familiarity and extend it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think, so it's interesting to think about where the places where even other kinds of designs have capitalized on that. And so one of the examples that I'll use is the idea that we use, and I talk about this in my media theory and criticism class when we talk about, Baudrillard's notion of hyperreality, right? This is very, very heady critical theory stuff, but the idea that we have a picture of a manila file folder on our computer to represent a file, right? That we use this thing that we don't really have very many of anymore as a tool to indicate to us that this is where you store papers, right? This is where you store the documents that you're creating. And so what happens when we don't use that structure is that folks tend to get really confused about like, well, where do things go? How does it work? So the idea that there's a file drawer or that we have a recycling bin, right? That all of those structures create that sense of familiarity so that we can interact with the tool in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming, but at the same time being able to build new things within the concept, right? It's like, it reminds me of me having to explain to my parents what the cloud is. And they want to know if like it's an actual cloud, like does it live in the sky? They have plenty of questions, right? All right, I'm going to bring everybody back. Yeah. Thanks, y'all. You can keep talking while I'm bringing folks back.
I just want to tell you a real story real quick here. So Albert William, Albert George, he did a 3D print of a floppy disk, and one of his students said, "Oh my God, that's amazing!
It's the save icon."
Yes, yes, they didn't know it was a floppy disk, and so he was like, "Oh, like that." So that was. He still tells that story till today. It was amazing.
Well, and that's important, right? Because that is, when we create things, when we create digital things out of material things, that can sort of shape the way that we interact with what is real and what is, and what is digital. And so it's interesting, I think, to think about those things. So everybody's coming back. Thank you all. Really, really great to have all of you back. We're just going to wait a few more minutes, get everybody back in the room. I know some folks had to sign off. Thank you all for your kind messages. So I would love to hear in your breakouts your responses to this question, which is essentially, in what ways is relying on nostalgia good? What does it bring to us? What do we get out of it? And in what ways is this sort of nostalgia, particularly what Ready Player One and Ready Player Two are built on? In what ways is this kind of a cop-out? Do you agree or disagree with that, Wired reviewer? Does anybody want to start? Maybe you had a good conversation in your small group that you would like to share? Not everybody all at once now.
I'll always go.
Thanks, Jen.
So first off, I feel like the 80s references aren't a cop out for what I would call like selling yourself out to make money, right? I liked the 80s references, that I always liked movies and TV shows and books that reference pop culture, because I kind of feel like it makes the characters more relatable. You're like, yeah, how many of us drop a Star Wars quote when we're at work or something like that? Or how many of us have our favorite comic book series that we will reference for things? And I also kind of like that some nostalgia stuff, because we're talking about how it's almost like become our kind of form of oral history. So, I brought up like the Wizard of Oz. So that's something that my grandparents and my parents and now I have seen. And it's something that, has been referenced through a bunch of stuff. So it's a good way, if your parents want to be like, oh, this was something that I enjoyed when I was a kid, maybe they've revamped it. So now maybe it's more easy for me to watch or something, especially with younger kids. They're so used to so much CGI now. But it's a way to kind of also be like, oh, and this is the era I grew up in, so this is why this kid's dressed like this. And I kind of compared it to like Wade in the first book when he goes to his old elderly neighbor just to find out all about the fun 80s. What I find dangerous, and we talked about how like marketing has kind of forced this, is when it's the overarching story that keeps getting reused over and over and over again. And so Mark in our group brought up like a lot of this could be some stuff with marketing, like what's sold in the past. So if you want to be sure that you're going to sell now, well, you just make a remake of it. And so it's harder for some of these more original ideas to get out there, because you're like, oh, we got to get 6 movies out and we got to make this many $1 billion. Well, okay, in order to do that, I have to do at least 2 remakes. So we were talking about how that's why things like Netflix have become kind of these outlets for original sources, because you have the things that you're familiar with, and then you're like, okay, I'll try this new thing. And you also know that you're not stuck there, right? If you don't like it, you stop it and you do another show.
Yeah, absolutely. Jen, I think that that's a really good point, that we see that sort of push and pull between creating something new and building, again, kind of from a profit margin standpoint on things that we've seen in the past. So I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure that to give folks at least 1 or 2 questions. We always, we started it a couple of minutes late. So if you need to sign off, I'll just say thank you. If you want to stay around and ask a question of George or Matthew, you're welcome to do that. Please just go ahead and turn on your mic and ask that question. And I would be happy to hear kind of what your thoughts are, or hear if you have questions or comments for George or Matthew. Thank you all. Mark, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, this either Matthew or George, you can take this one. But what I'm interested in understanding a little bit is that people that are doing the game programming and building the games, and you guys got them in your class, they're making decisions for the rest of us based on what they like. How do you get that out of it as when you're working with students? In other words, how do you get them to move away from what they like? Because I've seen so many video games over the past that have all been developed because somebody who programs it likes it. But how do we get away from that?
That's a great point, Mark, that it sort of squelches new voices, right? If we only get kind of what that same person likes over and over again. Matthew, do you want to answer that one?
Well, yeah, actually, Mark, thank you for the question. I actually take a 2-pronged approach to this. The first thing is that I do tell my students, especially in the beginning, I say, and this is in order to motivate them to work, I say, go with what you know and make a game. If you're not going to buy the game you're making, then you're not fully invested in it. So the first generation of game makers are going to make games that they do enjoy, that they do like, that they have fun with, and they make that. So, and then once they're able to get motivated and they've gone through the process, then we move into a second stage where then we give them challenges and say, okay, here is a game about cancer or diabetes. Now that you have made a bunch of games and you've gotten it out of your system, let's go to the other side. So let's have both the right and left hemispheres working on this. Let's have the like I tell people, it's always a good thing to do what you love and then show the world what you can do. And from that, you'll get a job and you'll get a client-based work and you'll do that. And there's a repetitive cycle. So Mark, to me, it's a A, B, up and down, left and right, black, white kind of thing. Do what you love, show that you can do it, and then accept the challenge from a client. That's how we do it. So that way, to me, those are the best game programmers, designers, storytellers, that they have a mix of both.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, George.
I'd like to add that I think a person can do their best work when they're passionate about something. I see this a lot in in student research papers, or even their thesis, their doctoral thesis or their master's thesis. If they're doing it to get the degree, then they're not going to have a good time. They need to be passionate about that research question. What are they trying to find? The answer that they're trying to get to. I think if you don't love it and if you don't have a passion for it, the quality of that end product will suffer. Now, I think we're getting to a point in time where the tools and the technology are so prevalent that it's not just a handful of lucky people that get the paintbrush and the paints to be able to, draw something amazing. But now we've sort of democratized it to a certain point where there's a lot of people making things. And I think that opens up the floodgates into having a lot of variety in content and not just, recycled content. In fact, I think because of this, a lot of the market will even dictate, what kind of innovation comes in and what recycled content sort of just falls off the side.
That's a great point, George. And I think that that really helps to kind of give us some food for thought as we think about kind of what does that future look like? What does the future, whether that's about gaming technology, solving business problems with technology, that we've got to have that mix of kind of that creativity with that. We need to be able to use it. We need to be able to incorporate it into our lives. And so thinking about what that looks like is a really important part of this, this evolutionary process. So I'm aware of the time, so let's do one more question from the group, one more question from the audience, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Matthew and George, for giving us your time tonight. Always so great to have you. One last question. Anybody want to have the last word? All right. Well, hearing none. So I am going to just remind all of you that our next event is Tuesday, February 23rd. So last Tuesday of the month, like always. We're reading Rocket Boys by Homer Hickman. And our guest expert is Eric Tiarino, who is a propulsion engineer for Blue Origin. So we've got a nice engineering bent to our next month's conversation. I'm excited to read Rocket Boys. If you would join me in thanking Matthew Powers and George, say your last name for me again, because I'll get it wrong.
It's Takahashi.
George Takahashi, thank you so much for being here and being with us tonight. We really appreciate your expertise. I hope you had fun and hope you had a nice opportunity to just kind of connect with others. I know that it's hard to feel connected during this time, so we really appreciate your giving of your time and your expertise. Also, please join me in thanking our amazing sponsors for being here with us as always. It's really, really helpful to have such a great group of folks supporting all of our work. So again, that's Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, the Indiana Public Library, and Central Indiana Science Outreach. Thank you all for continuing to support us. Please let your friends know about Books, Booze, and Brains. We do have our usual website, right, which is just Googleable. Just Google Books, Booze, and Brains. We're the only one out there. And also, we have some Facebook events, so please share those on social media. We would love to have more folks, particularly folks from the engineering community, for next month. So again, thank you all for engaging. Thank you again to our amazing experts, and we will sign off. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Thanks for
George.
having us.
Thanks, guys.